The air inside the grand courtroom was so heavy it felt like every breath carried the weight of a storm. The polished marble floors, the glowing chandelier overhead, and the dark wood benches faded into the background as murmurs filled the room. Then one voice cut through the noise like a strike of thunder. "That woman!" Richard Harlow bellowed, his hand shaking as he pointed toward the defense table. His words boomed, "She is a monster. She laid her hands on my little girl, left her bruised and broken, and dared to call it care. I demand justice. I demand punishment." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Reporters scrambled to jot every word, cameras clicked furiously, and the crowd leaned forward, hanging on every second. Richard wasn't just anyone, he was a billionaire, known for his towering presence and his sprawling empire. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he looked every bit the man used to the world obeying his voice. But across from him sat Grace Johnson. A black maid. A woman of modest means, dressed in a simple gray dress, her trembling hands folded tightly in her lap. Her hair was tied neatly, her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She looked fragile, but behind those quiet eyes lay a storm of fear. Everyone wondered the same question: how could a maid, a poor woman with no power, stand accused by one of the most powerful men in the city? The whispers around the courtroom grew louder. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Some had already judged her guilty. To many, the scale was already tilted. Richard was rich, Grace was poor. His word carried weight. Hers was a whisper. Grace lowered her head, her lips moving almost silently. "I never hurt her. God knows I never would." Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it would echo across the room. She thought of her children waiting at home, trusting she'd return after work like always. But what if she didn't? What if this lie stole everything she had fought for? The prosecutor began to read the charges in a cold, steady voice. "Grace Johnson, you are hereby accused of physically abusing a minor, Emily Harlow, age 9. The child's father claims you inflicted injuries while she was under your care." Every word struck Grace like a hammer: abuse, victim, injuries. Words she never thought could be tied to her name. She wasn't cruel. She was a caregiver, a nurturer, a woman who built her life on kindness and service. Yet here she was, facing the darkest accusation of her life. Richard's glare stayed fixed on her, full of rage and authority. To him, this wasn't about justice. It was about power. Grace was nothing more than the help, someone he thought could be destroyed with a single word. But Grace wasn't just a maid. For 3 years, she had been more than that inside his mansion. She had been the caretaker, the nurse, the confidant. She had held Emily when she cried, braided her hair before school, packed her lunches, and listened to her dreams. She had been the one to sit by the little girl's bedside during lonely nights. And now, in a cruel twist, she was accused of hurting the very child she loved as her own. The jury didn't see that bond. The audience didn't see the countless bedtime stories, the laughter in the kitchen, or the whispered nickname Emily gave her, Mama Grace. They only saw a billionaire's story, and to many, that was enough. On the other side of the room, Grace's lawyer shifted nervously. He was young, inexperienced, clearly no match for the giant standing across from them. Grace knew she couldn't count on him to outshine Richard's power. Richard slammed his hand on the stand, his voice cracking with a performance of grief. "My daughter is all I have left of my late wife. And this woman, this servant, betrayed my trust and scarred my child. I will not rest until she pays for what she's done." Grace's tears flowed now, not from guilt but from helplessness. She wanted to scream the truth, to cry out that she was innocent, but her voice caught in her throat. What power did she have against a billionaire whose money could bend headlines and buy loyalty? As the gavel struck and order was called, Grace's thoughts repeated one desperate prayer: the truth must come out. Please, Lord, let the truth come out. But in that moment, she looked less like an innocent woman and more like a lamb led to the slaughter, accused, humiliated, and standing under the crushing weight of Richard Harlow's fury. Yet deep inside, Grace held on to one fragile hope: the truth could still be spoken, but only if Emily, the little girl she loved like her own, found the courage to tell it. Grace sat quietly at the defense table, but inside, her thoughts churned like waves in a storm. She was no longer in the marble courtroom, her mind drifted back to her tiny apartment. 2 small bedrooms with peeling paint, an old couch that doubled as a bed, and the laughter of her children echoing in every corner. She could almost hear their voices calling for her. That memory reminded her of why she fought so hard every single day. Years earlier, when her husband walked out and left her alone with 2 little mouths to feed, life had nearly broken her. There were nights she skipped meals so her children could eat. There were mornings when she sent them to school in clothes she'd patched by hand. But no matter how hard it got, Grace held on to one unshakable truth: a mother's love can endure anything. Grace sat quietly at the defense table, but inside, her thoughts churned like waves in a storm. She was no longer in the marble courtroom, her mind drifted back to her tiny apartment. 2 small bedrooms with peeling paint, an old couch that doubled as a bed, and the laughter of her children echoing in every corner. She could almost hear their voices calling for her. That memory reminded her of why she fought so hard every single day. Years earlier, when her husband walked out and left her alone with 2 little mouths to feed, life had nearly broken her. There were nights she skipped meals so her children could eat. There were mornings when she sent them to school in clothes she'd patched by hand. But no matter how hard it got, Grace held on to one unshakable truth: a mother's love can endure anything. That love had carried her into the gates of Richard Harlow's mansion 3 years ago, and now it was the very love being used against her. She remembered her first day there. The towering iron gates, the endless driveway lined with roses, the mansion with its grand staircase and crystal chandeliers. It felt like stepping into another world, a world meant for people far above her station. But Grace hadn't gone there to admire wealth. She'd gone there to work, to earn every dollar she could, so her children wouldn't have to live the same cycle of poverty she had grown up in. Richard barely noticed her when she started. To him, she was just another worker. But Emily noticed. Grace would never forget the little girl peeking around a corner with her teddy bear, her blue eyes wide with shyness. Grace had crouched down, smiling warmly. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Grace. Do you like cookies?" Emily's face lit up instantly, and that was the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. From that day on, their bond grew quickly. Grace packed Emily's lunches, braided her hair, and walked her to the school bus. She became the steady hand in Emily's life while Richard was buried in endless meetings and business trips. Grace stayed by Emily's side when she was sick, comforted her when she cried, and tucked her in when nightmares came. Slowly, the little girl began to whisper a name that would break Grace's heart in the sweetest way: Mama Grace. Emily didn't mean to replace her late mother. She was simply filling an empty space in her heart, and Grace's love fit perfectly. Grace never corrected her. She only held Emily closer and whispered back, "I'm here, sweetheart. Always." But while Emily saw Grace as family, Richard saw her as nothing more than hired help. He never noticed the way his daughter's eyes lit up when Grace walked into the room. He never cared how tightly Emily clung to her hand at night. To him, Grace's presence was invisible, insignificant. And yet, in this courtroom, she was painted as the villain. Grace clenched her hands tightly under the table as memories poured in, memories of sleepless nights spent comforting Emily, of laughter filling the kitchen, of whispered secrets that only the two of them shared. To the world, she was just a maid on trial. But to Emily, she was the person who had made her feel loved and safe. That truth, however, was trapped behind the heavy silence of a courtroom where money spoke louder than love. Her lawyer leaned toward her, whispering nervously, "Stay calm. Don't react. We'll have our turn." His voice trembled with fear, and Grace could feel his doubt. She knew he was outmatched by Richard's wealth and influence. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them spill. She sat taller, whispering a silent prayer, "Lord, if no one else believes me, let Emily speak. Let the truth come from her lips." Because deep down, Grace knew her future didn't rest in the hands of the jury or the judge. It rested in the voice of a 9-year-old girl who held more courage than anyone in that room. Richard Harlow was not a man used to being challenged. From the time he inherited his father's empire at 25, he had been taught one simple lesson: money buys control. Problems could be silenced with a check, obstacles crushed with influence, and anyone who stood in his way could be removed as easily as sweeping dust off a table. And for years, that formula had worked perfectly. His business empire expanded, his name carried fear and respect, and in the eyes of the city, he was untouchable. But behind the polished suits and the powerful speeches, Richard carried a truth he refused to face. He was a father who had failed. When his wife passed away shortly after giving birth to Emily, Richard buried his grief in endless work. Instead of late-night feedings and bedtime stories, he chose late-night meetings and business deals. Instead of facing the emptiness of his home, he filled it with luxury and distance. Emily grew up surrounded by wealth, but starved of love. And then came Grace Johnson, the maid who changed everything without even trying. Richard noticed the little shifts almost immediately. Emily smiled more. She laughed when Grace was around. She clung to Grace's side when she was scared or lonely. On nights when Richard tried to kiss his daughter goodnight, Emily would sometimes whisper softly, "Grace already did." Those moments cut deeper than Richard wanted to admit. How could a maid, a woman he paid, mean more to his daughter than him, her father? That question festered inside him, unspoken but heavy, eating at his pride. So when bruises appeared on Emily's arm one morning, Richard didn't want explanations. The doctor had said it could have been a fall, but Richard wasn't interested in truth. He wanted a villain. He wanted someone to blame. And in his mind, Grace was the perfect target. To Richard, this wasn't about bruises at all, it was about control. About reclaiming his place in his daughter's heart. The night before the trial, Richard paced across his study, muttering under his breath, "She thinks she can replace me. She thinks she's the mother Emily needs. No. No one replaces me. No one." His glass of scotch shook in his hand as fury boiled inside him. By morning, his mask was back in place. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, staring at the reflection of a man who looked powerful, confident, untouchable. For a fleeting second, he saw the tired lines beneath his eyes, the emptiness in his stare. But he quickly looked away. Appearances were everything, and Richard knew how to play his role. And in court, he played it well. Every word he spoke dripped with authority. Every gesture was dramatic, every pause perfectly timed. "My daughter is all I have left of my late wife," he declared, his voice breaking with practiced grief. And this woman, this servant, betrayed my trust and scarred my little girl. The crowd nodded. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. Richard had always been a master storyteller, and he knew how to sell his version of events. But beneath the performance, his fury burned hotter. He hated the way Grace sat so quietly, her head bowed, her silence radiating dignity. He hated the way some jurors looked at her with sympathy. And most of all, he hated the risk that Emily might defend Grace instead of him. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of fear, not of the court, not of the jury, but of his own daughter's voice. He leaned toward his lawyer, his words sharp and low. Make sure she doesn't waver. Remind her of what's at stake. His lawyer nodded nervously, but even he could sense Richard's desperation. This trial wasn't just about allegations of abuse. It was a battle for dominance. Richard wasn't simply fighting Grace, he was fighting the truth, fighting the love between a child and the woman who had been there when he wasn't. Richard's jaw tightened as he looked across the room again. Grace sat trembling, her eyes wet with tears, but in her expression there was something that unsettled him more than anything, quiet strength. She looked fragile, but not broken. And that terrified him. Because deep down, Richard knew there were some things money couldn't buy, his daughter's love, Grace's dignity, or the truth. But instead of facing that reality, he buried it under even more rage. He slammed his hand on the table, his voice thundering, I will not rest until she pays for what she's done. The room went silent. To many, Richard looked like a grieving father demanding justice. But to those who looked closer, his fury wasn't just grief, it was fear disguised as power. And as the judge prepared to call Emily to the stand, Richard's heartbeat quickened. He wasn't afraid of the jury, or the law. What he feared most was that his daughter might finally speak the truth. The trial stretched on for hours. The whispers that had filled the courtroom at first faded into a tense silence as witness after witness took the stand. Richard Harlowe's staff, his butler, his cook, his driver, were all called to testify. But every word that came from their mouths felt careful, measured, as though weighed against the cost of angering the man who signed their checks. I never saw Miss Grace do anything harmful, the cook admitted nervously, twisting her apron. But I can't say what happened when I wasn't there. The butler repeated the same careful line. She always seemed kind to the child, but I wasn't always present. Their words cut Grace like knives. She wanted to leap from her chair and shout, tell the truth. You've seen how I cared for her. But she couldn't. She sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white, her tears burning hot in her eyes. Every hesitant answer was another stone in the wall Richard was building against her. Richard leaned back in his chair, smug. Each vague testimony gave him more confidence, more certainty that the case was his. The jury, the press, the judge, all of them saw his wealth, his reputation. And to Richard, that was enough. Grace's lawyer tried to cross-examine, but his voice was weak, trembling. He lacked the fire to push back against the weight of Richard's empire. Grace could see it in his eyes, even her own defender believed the odds were stacked too high. Her chest tightened, her prayers silent. God, please. Don't let this be the end. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge's voice echoed across the courtroom, bring in the final witness, Emily Harlowe. Gasps rippled through the room. The little girl at the center of it all was about to speak. The truth, or what people thought was the truth, would come from her lips. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Emily entered. She looked so small against the grandeur of the courtroom, her tiny shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. She clutched her teddy bear tightly against her chest, her blonde hair neatly combed, her wide blue eyes scanning the crowd nervously. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered silently, "Sweet child, please be brave." All the wealth in the room, all the lawyers, all the power, none of it mattered now. Everything rested on the voice of a 9-year-old girl. Emily was led gently to the witness stand. She climbed up, her small hands gripping the edge as though it were too big for her. Her eyes flicked across the courtroom until they landed on Grace. For a brief moment, her lips trembled, and it looked as if she might cry. But Grace gave her the softest smile, a silent message of comfort. The lawyer leaned down, his tone as gentle as possible. "Emily, sweetheart, can you tell us what happened? Did Miss Grace hurt you?" The entire courtroom held its breath. Not a pen scratched, not a chair moved. Even the clicking of cameras stopped. Richard leaned forward, his lips curling into a confident smirk, waiting for the words that would destroy Grace. But what came instead shattered everything. "No," Emily said firmly, her small voice trembling, yet clear enough to be heard by all. "Grace never hurt me. She loves me. She's the only one who ever listens to me." Gasps filled the room. Reporters dropped their pens. Members of the jury widened their eyes. Even the judge leaned back, stunned. Richard's smirk disappeared instantly, his face paling before it flushed red with fury. "What?" he began, but the judge silenced him with a sharp glare. The lawyer blinked, stunned by the little girl's words. "Emily, are you sure? Can you explain what happened?" Emily nodded, hugging her teddy tighter. Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I fell down the stairs while I was playing. That's how I got the bruises. Grace didn't hurt me. She picked me up, hugged me, and made me soup. She always takes care of me when Daddy's not home." In that moment, truth finally entered the courtroom, not from lawyers, not from evidence, but from the pure voice of a child. The crowd erupted into whispers, the sound of disbelief and shock echoing through the chamber. Grace's tears finally spilled, but they were tears of relief. Her heart whispered, "Thank you, Emily. Thank you for being brave." But then Emily turned to her father, and her small voice carried words that sliced deeper than any verdict. "Daddy, why are you lying? Why are you trying to take Grace away from me? She's my family." The courtroom froze. All eyes turned to Richard. His fists clenched, his face twisted with rage, but before he could speak, the judge slammed his gavel. "Mr. Harlow, control yourself. Your daughter is speaking under oath." And for the first time, the mighty billionaire had no words. The silence that followed Emily's words felt like it could shatter glass. Every eye in the room stayed fixed on the small child clutching her teddy bear. The billionaire's empire of lies had just been pierced by the most unexpected voice, the voice of his own daughter. Emily's lips trembled, but she didn't stop. Her courage grew with every sentence. "I told you, Grace never hurt me. I slipped on the stairs. I was running too fast, and I fell. My teddy flew out of my hands, and I cried really hard. Grace picked me up right away. She kissed my arm and told me everything would be okay. She made me soup and sat with me until I fell asleep. She's never hurt me. Not once." Gasps rippled through the courtroom again. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned forward, their eyes softening toward Grace. Grace buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. To hear Emily call her like a mom in front of strangers, it was more powerful than any defense lawyer could have given. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't seeing a maid on trial. They were seeing a bond no amount of wealth could erase. But Emily wasn't finished. Her little hands clutched the teddy bear tighter as she turned toward her father. "Daddy, why are you doing this? You're never home. You don't see how much Grace takes care of me. When I'm sad, she sings to me. When I'm scared at night, she holds my hand. When I miss Mommy, she hugs me and tells me it's okay to cry. Grace is always there. Not you." The word struck harder than any gavel. Richard's face turned crimson, his jaw tight, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. Emily's voice wavered, tears filling her eyes. "You didn't even notice when I fell, Daddy. You weren't there. You're never there. But Grace was. She loves me. Why would you try to make people think she hurt me?" The crowd broke into whispers, louder this time, filled with sympathy for the child and disdain for the father. Members of the jury exchanged glances, their expressions softening toward Grace. Even the judge's stern face revealed a flicker of compassion. Grace's tears rolled freely. She had always known Emily was lonely, but hearing her say it aloud in front of strangers was almost unbearable. Richard slammed his hand on the table, his voice booming, "Emily, enough. You don't understand what's happening here." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Mr. Harlow, one more outburst and you'll be removed from this courtroom." Richard sank back into his chair, his fury spilling into silence. His carefully crafted story was collapsing before his eyes, not destroyed by evidence or lawyers, but by the unshakable honesty of a child. Emily sniffled, hugging her teddy tighter. "I don't want Grace to go away. She's my family. If you take her away, I'll have no one." The room shifted in that instant. The jury no longer saw Grace as an accused criminal, they saw her as the only love and safety Emily had left. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, glancing at Richard, then back at the judge. Even he seemed rattled by the testimony. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady but kind. "Emily, you've been very brave today. Thank you for telling us the truth. You may step down." Emily wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, but before leaving, she turned back toward Grace. Her small voice carried across the silent chamber. "I love you, Mama Grace." The words weren't shouted, but they struck with the weight of thunder. Grace's heart nearly burst. She mouthed back through her tears, "I love you too, sweetheart." The bailiff led Emily out, her little footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood, the maid wasn't the monster. The real villain was the billionaire, exposed by the truth of his own child. Richard sat frozen, his fury boiling under his skin. He wanted to shout, to threaten, to reclaim control. But deep down, he knew it was slipping away. The jury would never see him the same way again. The courtroom sat heavy with silence after Emily's words. Grace's hands trembled in her lap, still feeling the echo of the child's voice calling her Mama Grace. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but for the first time in days, they were not born of fear, they were tears of hope. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the jury filed out of the room to deliberate. 12 solemn faces carried the weight of a child's truth and a billionaire's lies. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Grace closed her eyes and prayed silently. "Lord, give them clarity. Let them see the truth." Across the room, Richard sat rigid, his face red with anger. His money, his lawyers, his influence, all of it had crumbled in an instant. For years, he had built an empire where power could bend reality, where no one dared to question his word. But his daughter's voice had cut through it all, leaving him exposed. In that moment, Richard Harlow, the man who believed money could buy everything, was powerless against the one thing he couldn't control, the truth. Minutes passed like hours. Grace replayed Emily's words in her mind, each one like a lifeline pulling her back from despair. "I love you, Mama Grace." That single phrase had carried more weight than any lawyer's argument. Finally, the jury returned. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, held a folded slip of paper in her hand. The judge unfolded it slowly, and the room held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Grace Johnson, not guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even soft applause filled the air. Grace's body shook as sobs of relief burst from her chest. She pressed her hands together, whispering, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you." Her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Grace. You're free." But the judge wasn't finished. He raised his gavel once more. "Furthermore, this court finds Mr. Richard Harlow's accusations to be unfounded and malicious. Charges of perjury and defamation will now be considered against him." The word struck Richard like a blow. His jaw tightened, his fists balled, but he couldn't move. The man who once ruled with fear now sat in silence, humiliated before the very people he thought he controlled. Grace had not only been cleared, she had watched her accuser's empire of lies collapse in front of him. Just then, the courtroom doors opened. Emily broke free from the court officer's hand and ran across the room. "Grace," she cried. Grace dropped to her knees, arms wide open, as Emily leapt into them. They clung to each other, sobbing openly. Emily buried her face into Grace's shoulder, whispering, "I knew they'd believe me. I told them you're my Mama Grace." The crowd couldn't hold back their emotions. Many wiped away tears. Even the judge, usually stern and unyielding, allowed the faintest smile. Grace kissed Emily's hair, whispering, "You saved me, sweetheart. You were so brave." Emily pulled back, cheeks wet but eyes shining. "No, you saved me first. I just told the truth." Those words cut through Grace's heart. It was simple. It was pure. Love had been stronger than fear. For all his wealth and power, Richard had lost everything. And Grace, once invisible, once accused, had gained something he could never buy, the unbreakable bond of a child's love. Richard stood motionless. His daughter didn't even glance his way. Security approached, signaling him to leave. He hesitated for a moment, something flickering in his hardened eyes, regret, maybe. But before he could speak, Emily turned toward him. Her voice was soft but sharp as glass. "Daddy, I don't hate you. But I don't trust you anymore." That single sentence crushed him more than any verdict ever could. He lowered his head and walked out of the courtroom alone. News spread quickly across the city. Headlines blared, "Billionaire exposed by daughter's testimony." Grace's face appeared on television screens, in newspapers, not as a criminal but as a symbol of resilience. She had become a story of hope, proof that even the voiceless could find justice. But for Grace, fame wasn't what mattered. What mattered was home. Weeks later, she sat on the porch of a modest little house, sipping tea while Emily colored in a sketchbook beside her. The child's laughter returned, filling the air with warmth. Grace still worked hard, but now she worked freely, no shadow of false accusations hanging over her. Emily rested her head against Grace's arm. "Do you think Daddy will ever come back?" she asked softly. Grace paused, then answered gently, "Maybe one day, when he learns how to tell the truth. But no matter what, you'll always have me. I'm not going anywhere." Emily smiled, hugging her tightly. "Good. Because you're my forever Mama Grace." Grace's heart swelled. She had walked into Richard's mansion as a maid, overlooked and powerless. But she left the courtroom as something far greater. In the eyes of a child, she was a mother. In the end, the storm of lies, betrayal, and injustice had passed. What remained was love, pure, unshakable, victorious. Grace whispered softly, as sunlight wrapped around them like a golden promise, "Truth always wins. Love always wins." If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear that truth and love can overcome even the darkest lies. Join us as we continue telling stories where justice, dignity, and courage always find their voice.